Well, damn, I definitely hear y'all. I was already thinking of continuing reviewing the rest of the Booster Course Pass waves individually anyway, and considering my last one is doing better than just about any non-shitpost video I've ever made, I think it's safe to say it will be worth doing. Truth be told, a big part of me starting the Cup Ranking series was because I wanted to talk about the BCP tracks, but considering at this rate it's going to be a long time until I even start working on that video in the first place, these smaller videos will do the job just fine. Expect to see more of these around the next anniversary for each wave. That said, the next wave up to talk about is Wave 2. I think this is the point where the pass became a lot more hype for a lot more people. Wave 1 was a good enough start, but there's just something about it where just about every track blends together for me. Like, just about every track either takes place in the daytime, it's in a grassy area, and or it's in some kind of cityscape. Even tracks that checked off those boxes less, like Choco Mountain and Sky Garden, just didn't feel quite distinct enough from the rest of the wave for me. The only real exception to any of this being Ninja Hideaway. Not to mention, of course, there was the controversy over the graphics, where you could definitely tell that while overall mostly retextured, it wasn't enough to keep these from feeling largely identical to their tour counterparts. So in the months leading up to Wave 2, it was hard not to think of the rest of the Booster Course Pass as being just more of Wave 1. Of course, there were data mines and leaks floating around that proved otherwise, at least in terms of the specific track picks. Not to mention the fact that with how many tracks were slated for the DLC, we were simply going to get more unique picks one way or another. A lot of weight was put on Wave 2 though, as it would definitely be indicative of what exactly we could expect for the rest of the BCP. After a nearly 5-month wait, the longest between any wave of the pass, we finally got our Wave 2 announcement in late July, and it was definitely looking promising for the future of Mario Kart 8. Like last time, I'm going to start off with the cities. The picks this time were interesting. I mean, New York Minute was pretty much a shoo-in for this wave, considering that it seemed after Wave 1 they really wanted to knock out the more basic city courses from early tour before getting to the really good ones. Sydney Sprint, on the other hand, was a bit more of a surprise to be getting this soon. Not only was its debut in tour only a little over a year beforehand, but it also still hadn't released its third route in tour at this point, setting a precedent that any city was on the table to come at any time, as long as at least one variant already existed in tour. This definitely threw off my somewhat hopeful prediction that LA would be in Wave 2. Instead, we had to wait almost a full other year for that one. As for the cities themselves, New York was the first new track ever added to tour, and it definitely feels like one of the first. I do see why they held this one off for Wave 2, since it is aesthetically more interesting than Paris and Tokyo, and in some areas the track design is just a bit more interesting, especially considering this one actually has you go into a building at one point. Ultimately though, it probably would have been best put in Wave 1 had there been an extra city slot in that wave, because it definitely feels small and a bit cramped like the other early tour cities. Sydney Sprint, on the other hand, had the advantage of launching much later in tour's lifetime, though as I found out recently, it may have actually been one of the earliest cities planned for the game, which might have contributed to it showing up in the BCP this early. Sydney is the first city to show up in the past that I, and most others, could actually call great. It's ultimately flatter and simpler than most of the cities that showed up in the second year of the DLC, but when the track design is as good as it is here, I don't think that's too big of a deal. This is one of the first cities that started getting more creative with implementing its routes. While New York and Tokyo pretty much directly follow the exact routes they had in tour, even going as far as to have the number of the variant correspond with the number of laps, Sydney takes things in a different direction. Literally. Lap 1 is pretty much what you'd expect, being the same as Sydney 1 from tour. Lap 2, on the other hand, starts off with the unreleased Sydney 3, but instead of turning to go back to the finish line, you keep going straight up the bridge and drive the route of Sydney 2. Considering how short Sydney 2 is, and the fact that it didn't add much compared to the other two variants, this was a very smart call to make, since it would have been very underwhelming if it was its own lap here. So what about the last lap? We already hit all 3 routes in the first 2 laps, so where do we go from here? Well, since we end up following Sydney 2 exactly how it is in Tour to finish lap 2, we end up in a situation where we're finishing that lap from the direction it started. Naturally, they build on this by making lap 3 be lap 1 in reverse. I've loved when they've done stuff like this. It helps to represent the R variants from Tour, while also adding a unique twist to some tracks that may have played things fairly straight otherwise. Wave 2 truly shines though in its retro selection. Every single pick here has a completely unique look and feel from one another, which definitely helps with giving more variety to both Wave 2 and the BCP as a whole up to this point. The first of these I want to talk about is SNES Mario Circuit 3, the first of 2 SNES picks in the entire DLC. Now, I definitely hear the complaints about this one, and I don't completely disagree with them. Yes, the course, for the most part, looks borderline identical to its original counterpart. Yes, the course is completely flat still, even being one of 2 tracks in the entire game without a single opportunity for tricking. Yes, even the music barely sounds different compared to the original. The thing is though, I think that was the point. The way I see it, Mario Circuit 3 is specifically meant to be a nostalgic pick that's meant to stand out in a game full of revamps as being as reasonably close to the original as possible. Think how the N64 stages in Smash Ultimate are kept pretty much the same as their originals, and you kinda get the idea. Now, does this make the course objectively good or anything like that? Not exactly, and I do get how many would be disappointed that they didn't give a larger revamp to this course like we got for the other SNES courses in the game. I do though think it is worth looking at this course under this light and accounting for this fact and talking about it. Something I did notice when it was announced in the trailer though is they did add in some more background details. Of course you have spectators added, which is pretty much par for the course in 8 at this point. But they also add a lot of decorations from the platformers, specifically Mario 1. You have the flagpoles, some brick blocks, piranha plants coming out of pipes, and while it isn't as easy to notice this stuff during a race, I do still appreciate them adding these details to the track. Now, I talked in my last video about how I wanted to see the Wii retros from 7 and 8, but Mushroom Gorge was always the one I was least inclined to see. I mean, we were guaranteed 6 Wii tracks for the entire BCP because of the prefix sleep, and Coconut Mall, Maple Treeway, and Koopa Cape alone would have made up half of those. Wii Rainbow Road was a shoo-in as long as it made it into Tour, considering the last slot for the entire pass had the Wii label. So if Mushroom Gorge made it too, that would have left only one more Wii track, which I was personally hoping would be DK Summit. That wasn't necessarily an issue for me, as Koopa Cape and DK Summit are my favorite 2 Wii tracks, so getting those, the rest of the 3DS Wii retros, and Rainbow Road to cap it all off would have been just fine with me. I was worried though that if we got even more Wii tracks in Tour, then ones I wanted would start getting left behind. Hell, we knew by Wave 1 that Dry Dry Ruins was already being planned for Tour because of data mines, so who's to say there isn't even more to be added beyond that? All of this to say, I was fine enough with Mushroom Gorge, but relatively neutral on it. I mean, it's a pretty visually samey grass track, with the exception of the cave section, of course, and they're basing it on the Tour version, which was basically the 3DS version, but the mushrooms are set up even more flatly because of Tour's simpler controls. Considering the Wave 1 tracks didn't really do any big changes to the track models from Tour, I just didn't have the highest hopes. Everything changed though upon actually seeing it in 8. When watching the trailers, more and more things seemed to be getting uncovered. From the mushroom shortcut at the start finally returning again after being absent since Wii, to the cave section not only including the 2 paths from 3DS and Tour, but also a 3rd route based on the one from Wii that got replaced by the glider in the future installments. Already this was looking to be the definitive version of this track, but this only became solidified when it dropped and people figured out that the gap jump at the end was still possible. Mushroom Gorge is genuinely one of the best remakes in the early BCP, and it made me fall in love with this track all over again and remember why it was so loved in the first place. Wave 2 had good track picks, but admittedly a lot of them were pretty expected. I mean, everyone expected one of the SNES Mario circuits for sure, regardless of which one. Mushroom Gorge was a pretty likely Wii track considering it was one of the only ones in tour at the moment. Pretty much all of them were expected except for one. Our GBA track of Wave 2 is Snowland, which caught everyone off guard. Not only was it not in tour at this point, or even rumored for the game if I remember right, but it's also one of the less popular tracks from the game, so it was honestly kind of eye-opening to see it get the full overhaul treatment that modern GBA remakes had been getting. It really made me wonder what other GBA tracks could be next. Spoiler alert, basically all of them. But that's besides the point. This track ended up adding its own ultra shortcut, which seemed to be becoming increasingly more common as we delve further and further into the DLC. In this case, you can turn early on the first big straightaway, and use a mushroom to cut off a majority of the turn leading into the frozen lake section. In general, Snowland just has a lot of mushroom shortcuts of different varieties, which can make for very fun races once you get past the ice physics. Moving on though, we also had our second and final N64 track for 8 Deluxe, being Calamari Desert. I'm very happy this track made the game, especially after this tweet Nintendo made before the Switch was even announced. I highly doubt something like the BCP was being planned all the way back then, but it still was a cool full circle moment to see this one show up. As for the remake itself, they absolutely killed it. The new glider shortcuts from the 3DS are still intact, but they did something awesome that me and a lot of other tour players were hoping they would. Lap 1 plays out as normal, but laps 2 and 3 follow the route of Calamari Desert 2 from Mario Kart Tour, which is basically the same, but with a loop through the train track halfway through. This, I think, was especially effective in showing the potential of the changing arrows that Tour cities used. These weren't just reserved for new tracks. Now we know they can be used for rerouting retro tracks going forwards, and I'm extremely excited to see what they do with this concept going forwards. The final retro track I have to talk about for Wave 2 is of course Waluigi Pinball. This is my favorite track in the entire series, so naturally I'm going to love it. As I said in my last video, this was pretty much a shoo-in, so I was never really worried that it was going to happen. That didn't make it any less exciting to see it announced though. I remember when Tour was about to release and we got a trailer for it, Waluigi Pinball was shown off and it got a noticeable redesign, which always made me sad that we didn't end up seeing it in 8. Now that exact version of the track is in 8, almost 3 years later. There honestly isn't anything really changed in the track design itself, only aesthetically. I would say there doesn't really need to be anything changed, but honestly, I do agree with a lot of people saying it would be nice if there was a shortcut or two added to the track, just to give it that last little push. Hopefully we do get that when this track returns again, because you know for a fact it's gonna. Now that we're done with the retros, we do have one last track to cover. If you were getting into BCP speculation early on, you may remember the banner data mine. If you don't, it was an alternate version of the BCP key art that was found in the files of the Wave 1 update. This was chock full of tracks that hadn't been announced for the past yet, as well as some that weren't even released for tour yet. This included most cities that were known up to that point, including images of the unannounced Amsterdam and Bangkok tracks. Waluigi Pinball, DK Summit, 3DS Rainbow Road, and Waluigi Stadium were also there. Among these was one major standout, a never-before-seen ice cream track. This one especially caught the attention of speculators, rightly so considering it's the only non-city Nitro that didn't already exist in Tour that was on this banner. The months went on, speculation only growing, especially in mid-July when the Ocean Tour was revealed for Mario Kart Tour. For those who didn't keep up with Tour when it was still getting new content, when new tours were announced, in addition to the main trailer for the tour, we also got a trailer for that tour's wave of Mii suits. Each one of these trailers ended with a tease of the next tour's new Mii suit wave. which usually gave us an idea of what new content would be added in the next tour. In this case, this was the silhouette we got. I don't know, man, that shit looks pretty definitively like ice cream. So already, we knew we would probably be seeing the Ice Cream Nitro finally show its face in 2 weeks when we get the next tour's trailer. What we didn't expect was what would happen a week later.
Rev up for these 8 courses in Wave 2. Sky High Sunday.
Yep, that's right. Called Sky High Sunday, and we're getting it in Mario Kart 8 first. This was definitely a shock at the time, considering the Booster Course Pass was originally announced as a collection of remastered courses only. Technically, this is still true, as Sky High Sunday and the other quote-unquote new tracks were ultimately developed for Tour first, but it was still really awesome to see that not only were we going to be getting these courses to begin with, but also it's completely on the table for them to make their debut in the DLC. Unfortunately though, this one ended up being a bit of a disappointment. While it was nice to be getting a brand new track, it became very clear even by looking through the trailer that this track would just be another one that boils down to being a big oval. Sure, it's the most uniquely themed big oval, and there's still more variety in its track design, but for a lot of people, it was very hard to look past that fact. Not to mention, the track is kinda wonky. Don't get me wrong, I'm always here for some major jank in my games, especially when it adds to the fun, but I do see why many aren't exactly here for it in this case. They also made the entire track anti-grav, which is a bit of an odd decision, but one I feel like was made in response to the Wave 1 complaints. I just think this wasn't the best way to implement it, as you never really invert or drive on anything particularly steep, aside from maybe the ice cream cone turn at the end. The floatiness does come in handy in some cases, like with the blind jump, but at the same time, the floatiness just wouldn't have even been needed there in the first place had that jump been handled a little bit better. I do like how you can get spin boosts off the railing in certain areas of the track, but I do also think they could have maybe done more to indicate to those who don't know that this was possible in the first place. Like, maybe they could have made the railings blue with a bit of a glow, for instance. It's just little things like that. Sky High Sunday is a track I really think gets more hate than it deserves, but considering it is the first track to make its debut in the DLC, I can understand why many were disappointed with it, especially with having to follow up a track as well designed as Ninja Hideaway. A little extra polish would have gone a very long way here, but in the end, it causes an overall solid wave to end on one of its weaker inclusions. The Wave 2 update as a whole was a lot less interesting than the ones that follow, mainly because this was still 2 waves before they started adding characters. The only real changes they made were making the Coconut Mall cars into actual obstacles again, as well as giving the Wave 1 tracks a little bit of extra polish overall by making the dirt and grass stain your tires and adjusting the lighting a bit, which can best be seen when comparing the track thumbnails. I do wish they kept up doing little hotfixes like this in future waves though, because some tracks definitely needed it. Looking at you, Sunset Wilds. Anyway though, that about does it for this video. I'll see y'all in about 3 months or so to talk about Wave 6, since that's the next anniversary to be up. It's just hitting me while writing this that Wave 1 will end up being the last one I talk about, so that's cute. Anyway, I'll see y'all then. Bye! Pretty much all of them were expected except for one. Our GBA Wave track... Jesus.